There are moments in life when the body tells a story the mind is not yet ready to hear. When the organs that hold us together become unwilling witnesses to the betrayals we cannot yet name. When a woman looks at the scar across her abdomen and realizes it is not just tissue that has been cut open, but the very architecture of trust itself. The foundation of everything she believed about love, sacrifice, and what it means to offer someone not just your heart, but the literal components of your survival. And Carmen knew this truth the morning she woke up 6 months after the surgery to find divorce papers on the kitchen table, placed there with a kind of clinical precision that felt almost surgical. As if her husband had learned something about detachment from watching the doctors slice into her body, as if he had studied the way they separated her from part of herself and thought, yes, this is how you remove something that has become inconvenient. She remembers the surgery day with a clarity that surprises her. How the hospital light filtered through those vertical blinds in that particular way that only medical facilities seem to achieve. A sterile kind of illumination that makes everything look both too bright and somehow drained of life. And she remembers holding his hand, her husband Richard's hand, feeling the warmth of his palm against hers and thinking, this is what marriage is, this is the ultimate proof of my love. This is the moment when I demonstrate that my body is not just mine but ours. That I would carve myself open to keep him alive. That there is no greater gift than the one I am about to give. And she remembers the anesthesiologist's gentle voice counting backward, the strange floating sensation as the drugs took hold, and her last conscious thought being a kind of peaceful certainty that she was doing the right thing, the heroic thing, the thing that would bind them together forever in a way that nothing else could. The neuroscience of sacrifice is more complex than most people realize. Because when we make the decision to give something irreplaceable to another person, the brain doesn't simply calculate cost and benefit. It engages a whole cascade of neurochemical processes that intertwine with our deepest attachments, our sense of identity, and our need for meaning. The ventral tegmental area floods with dopamine at the thought of being needed, of being essential to someone's survival. The anterior cingulate cortex lights up with the anticipation of social bonding and recognition, and the prefrontal cortex constructs elaborate narratives about what this sacrifice will mean for the relationship. Stories we tell ourselves about gratitude and eternal connection and debts that can never be repaid. And these neural pathways are so powerful that they can override the more primitive regions of the brain that might otherwise signal danger, that might otherwise say, wait, pause. Consider what you are giving away and whether the recipient truly sees its value. Carmen had met Richard when she was 27, at a point in her life when she was just beginning to understand herself as separate from her family, as someone who might have needs and desires that existed independently of what others expected from her. And he had seemed like a revelation, a man who listened when she spoke, who seemed genuinely interested in her thoughts about art and literature and the small observations she made about the world, who made her feel seen in a way she had never experienced before. And they married within 18 months, a wedding her mother had called impulsive but Carmen had felt was simply right, simply meant to be. And for the first few years the marriage had the quality of a dream she didn't want to wake from. Dinners that stretched late into the night, weekend trips where they would get lost on purpose just to see where they ended up. A shared language of inside jokes and meaningful glances that made her feel like they inhabited a private world. But there had been signs, small fractures she had taught herself not to see, the way Richard would sometimes go silent when she was excited about something. A particular kind of silence that felt less like listening and more like enduring. The way he would make decisions about their life together and present them as fait accompli, already decided, already arranged, as if her input was a formality rather than a necessity. The way he spoke to waiters and customer service people with a dismissiveness that made her uncomfortable, but that she explained away as stress, as the pressure of his job, as anything other than what it actually was, which was a belief that some people mattered and some people didn't, and that the distinction was his to make. And she remembers now how she would feel a small knot in her stomach when these moments occurred, how her body was trying to tell her something her mind refused to acknowledge. How the nervous system knows things before consciousness catches up, how the amygdala processes threat long before the prefrontal cortex can construct a rational explanation. When Richard was diagnosed with kidney disease 5 years into their marriage, Carmen experienced it as a catastrophe that was also somehow a clarification. A terrible event that nevertheless made everything else make sense. Because now she understood why he had been tired, why he had been irritable, why their intimate life had become sporadic and strained. And she threw herself into being the perfect caregiver with a ferocity that surprised even her, researching diets and treatments, driving him to every appointment, holding his hand through the fear and the uncertainty. And it felt right, it felt like her purpose. And when the nephrologist first mentioned that living donors were often the best option, Carmen knew immediately what she would do, knew with a certainty that required no deliberation that she would offer her kidney, that this was what love demanded, what marriage meant. And she remembers the look on Richard's face when she told him. A look she interpreted as gratitude and relief, but that she wonders now might have been something else, something more complicated, something that included calculation. The psychology of caregiving in intimate relationships operates along pathways that are deeply gendered, carved out by generations of conditioning that teaches women that their value lies in their capacity to nurture, to sacrifice, to put others' needs before their own. And these lessons don't arrive as explicit instructions, but as 1,000 tiny messages absorbed from childhood, from watching mothers exhaust themselves, from fairy tales where the princess's worth is measured by her willingness to suffer for love, from cultural narratives that celebrate female self-abnegation as the highest form of virtue. And these messages embed themselves in the neural architecture, become part of how we understand ourselves and our place in the world, so that when the opportunity to sacrifice arises, it doesn't feel like a choice so much as an inevitability, a script we have been rehearsing our whole lives without realizing we were in a play. Patricia had a different story but the same architecture of sacrifice underlying it. She was a woman Carmen would later meet in a support group, a woman who had given her husband years of financial support while he pursued what he called his passion, which was writing screenplays that never sold, living on her income, while he spent days in coffee shops crafting dialogue that no one would ever speak. And Patricia had believed in him with a fervor that bordered on religious, had organized her entire life around protecting his creative time, had taken on extra work to cover their expenses, had smiled through the dinner parties where people asked what her husband did, and she answered with a kind of defensive pride that he was an artist, a writer, someone who refused to compromise his vision for commercial success. And she had believed the story they told together about how his breakthrough was just around the corner, how one day everyone would see what she already saw, how her sacrifice would be vindicated by his eventual recognition. But the day had come, as days like that do, when Patricia opened an email on their shared computer and discovered that for the past 2 years her husband had been having an affair with a woman he had met at one of those coffee shops, a woman who was also an aspiring writer. And the emails were filled with a tenderness and attention that Patricia hadn't received in years, filled with careful readings of this other woman's work, with elaborate compliments and expressions of admiration. And Patricia had felt something crack open inside her, not because of the sexual betrayal, though that was painful enough, but because she realized he had energy for someone else's dreams, attention for someone else's creative struggles, that the exhaustion he claimed when she tried to share her own day, her own challenges, was apparently available in abundance for this stranger. And she understood in that moment that she had been funding not just his artistic ambitions, but his capacity to court someone else, that her sacrifice had created the very conditions of her own abandonment. The nervous system responds to betrayal differently than it responds to other forms of loss, because betrayal involves not just the loss of the relationship, but the loss of the story you told yourself about the relationship, the collapse of the narrative framework that made sense of your sacrifices, that gave meaning to your choices. And this creates a particular kind of cognitive and emotional chaos. The amygdala floods the system with cortisol and adrenaline signaling danger, signaling that the world is not what you thought it was, while the hippocampus struggles to integrate this new information with existing memories, to reconcile the person who held your hand during surgery with the person who is now asking for a divorce. And this process of integration can take months or even years, can involve the painful work of going back through memories and reinterpreting them, seeing them through a different lens, recognizing the signs you missed, the ways you explained away behavior that should have alarmed you. Carmen spent the first weeks after finding the divorce papers in a state of numbness that felt almost chemical, moving through her days with mechanical precision, going to work, coming home, preparing meals she didn't eat. And there was a strange quality to this time, as if she was watching herself from a distance, as if the woman who was living this life was not really her but some avatar she was controlling from very far away. And her friends would later tell her this was shock, protective dissociation. The psyche's way of creating distance from an experience too overwhelming to process all at once. And she would understand this intellectually. But in the moment, it felt more like a kind of death. Like the Carmen who had believed in love and sacrifice had simply ceased to exist, and this new person had taken her place. Someone going through the motions without any sense of why the motions mattered. Richard had moved out within 2 weeks of presenting the papers, and his departure had the quality of a magic trick. Here one day and gone the next, as if he had been practicing vanishing, and Carmen would walk through their apartment that was now just her apartment, and notice all the empty spaces, the gaps on the bookshelf where his books had been, the missing towels from the bathroom, the way the closet had become an accusation of absence. And she would sit on the edge of the bed they had shared and try to understand how a man could accept an organ from your body and then decide you were disposable, could take something so intimate, so irreplaceable, and then treat you like a problem to be solved through paperwork and property division. The question of what Richard owed her became an obsession in those early weeks. Not in a legal sense, though her lawyer would certainly have opinions about that, but in an existential sense, because Carmen needed to understand what the kidney had meant, whether it was a gift or a transaction, whether it created an obligation or was supposed to be freely given with no expectation of return. And she would lie awake at night doing calculations that made no sense, weighing her sacrifice against his betrayal, trying to find an equation that would make it balance. And she slowly began to realize that this was the wrong question, that the problem wasn't about what Richard owed her, but about what she had owed herself, about the part of her that had believed her value lay in what she could provide rather than in her inherent worth, the part that had confused love with self-erasure, that had thought being needed was the same as being valued. Isabel was a therapist Carmen began seeing 3 months after the divorce papers appeared. A woman in her 60s with gray hair she wore natural, and a way of listening that made Carmen feel like she could say anything. Like there was no thought too dark or too angry to be spoken aloud. And Isabel had specialized in working with women who had experienced what she called disproportionate sacrifice in intimate relationships. And in their first session, Isabel had asked Carmen a question that seemed simple, but that Carmen found she couldn't answer. The question was, who taught you that love meant disappearing? And Carmen had opened her mouth to respond and then closed it again, and then opened it again, and found she was crying, not delicate tears, but the kind of crying that comes from somewhere deep in the body, that shakes the shoulders and makes breathing difficult. And Isabel had simply sat with her in that crying. Had not tried to fix it or hurry it along, had just created space for the grief to move through. Over the following months, Carmen and Isabel began excavating her history, looking at the patterns that had led to the kidney, to the marriage, to the belief that her worth was measured by what she could endure. And they talked about Carmen's mother, a woman who had sacrificed her own career to support Carmen's father's ambitions, who had moved 6 times in 10 years for his job transfers, who had smiled through it all with what Carmen now recognized as a kind of performance. A mask of cheerful accommodation that hid something more complicated underneath. And Carmen could see now how she had absorbed this model without questioning it. How she had learned that good women shrink, that love means making yourself smaller so others can expand, that the highest compliment was to be told you were low maintenance, as if having needs was a character flaw rather than a basic fact of being human. The neuroscience of early attachment teaches us that our first relationships literally shape the architecture of our brains, that the way we are loved or not loved as children creates neural pathways that become our default settings for how we understand intimacy. And if we learn early that love is conditional, that it must be earned through performance or perfection, that our needs are burdensome, then we carry these patterns into our adult relationships, repeating them with eerie precision. Seeking out partners who will confirm what we already believe about ourselves. And breaking these patterns requires not just insight but the actual creation of new neural pathways. The slow work of teaching the brain that safety can feel different from what we learned, that we can be worthy without being perfect, that our needs are not shameful but human. Carmen began to remember things from her childhood that she had not thought about in years, small scenes that suddenly seemed significant, like the time she was 8 years old and had won second place in a school art competition, how she had run home excited to show her mother, and her mother had looked at the ribbon and said with what Carmen had interpreted as encouragement, "Next time you'll get first." And Carmen could see now how that moment had taught her that second place was failure. That almost good enough was not good enough, that she needed to try harder, be better, achieve more, And there had been 1,000 moments like that, each one tiny, each one seemingly insignificant, but together they had accumulated into a belief system. A way of understanding herself that was fundamentally about inadequacy, about never quite measuring up, about needing to prove her worth through extraordinary effort. She remembered being 12 and having her first period, how embarrassed she had felt, how her mother had given her supplies and instructions delivered in a whisper, as if menstruation was something shameful that needed to be hidden, how she had learned to be vigilant about any sign that might reveal her body's natural functions, to carry supplies in opaque bags, to never ask to be excused from activities because of cramps. And she could see now how this had taught her that her body was both untrustworthy and something to be managed in service of others' comfort, that her physical needs were at best an inconvenience, and at worst something to be ashamed of, and this had made it easier, hadn't it, to later offer up an organ, to think of her body as something whose purpose was utility rather than a vessel that housed herself, her actual self, the person whose needs also mattered. The support group Isabel recommended met on Tuesday evenings in the basement of a community center. Folding chairs arranged in a circle, coffee in styrofoam cups that stained your fingers. And Carmen almost didn't go to that first meeting. Sat in her car outside for 10 minutes trying to decide if she was ready to name what had happened to her in front of strangers. If she could bear to hear herself say the words, "I gave my husband a kidney and he divorced me." Because saying it out loud felt like it would make it more real somehow, would cement it as the defining fact of her life rather than a surreal interlude she might wake up from. But she went inside finally, heart pounding, and she sat in that circle and she listened. There was Maria, who had supported her husband through law school, working 2 jobs while he studied, taking care of their children, managing every aspect of their household. And when he graduated and got a position at a prestigious firm, when he started making the kind of money that meant Maria could finally stop working so hard, he sat her down and told her he wanted a divorce, that he had grown beyond her, that they were no longer compatible, that he needed someone who could match his new social status. And Maria told this story without crying, told it with a kind of flat affect that was somehow worse than tears, that suggested she had told it so many times she had worn away its emotional edges. And Carmen recognized something in that telling, that protective distance, that way of turning yourself into a character in a story so you can survive hearing it spoken aloud. There was Diane, who had nursed her husband through cancer, 2 years of chemotherapy and radiation, the endless appointments, the sickness, the fear, the night vigils, the intimate indignities of illness that test the boundaries of love. And she had done it all with what she thought was grace, with a determination to be the strong one, the rock he could depend on. And when he went into remission, when the 5-year mark passed and he was declared cancer-free, he told her he felt like he needed a fresh start. That the marriage reminded him of illness, that he needed to feel young again, alive again, and he left her for a woman 15 years younger. And Diane said the thing she still couldn't understand was how he could have lain in a hospital bed holding her hand, could have looked at her with what seemed like profound gratitude, could have said he couldn't have survived without her, and then simply walk away once he didn't need her anymore, as if her value had been purely functional. As if she was like a crutch to be discarded once you could walk on your own. The pattern that emerged in these stories was so consistent it felt almost algorithmic. Women who had given enormously, who had restructured their entire lives around someone else's needs, who had received what looked like gratitude in the moment of need but had discovered that gratitude was not the same as love, that being needed was not the same as being valued, that some people related to others primarily through utility, through what could be extracted, and once the extraction was complete, once there was nothing left to take, they simply moved on, and Carmen began to understand that what had happened to her was not unique, was not even particularly unusual, was part of a larger pattern of how some people understood relationships, as transactional rather than reciprocal, as something to be optimized rather than honored, and this understanding was both painful and somehow liberating. Because it meant the problem was not something broken in her, but something broken in a system that had taught her to confuse self-sacrifice with love. The work of therapy became about helping Carmen distinguish between genuine generosity and the kind of giving that comes from a wound, between acts of love that emerge from fullness and acts of accommodation that emerge from fear of abandonment or worthlessness. And Isabel explained that there is a particular kind of giving that is actually a form of self-harm, giving that depletes us, that leaves us empty, that we do not because we want to but because we believe we must. And learning to recognize this difference required Carmen to slow down, to pause before agreeing to things, to notice what her body felt when she said yes to something she didn't want to do. The slight nausea, the tightness in her chest, the way her voice would go higher and softer. And Isabel taught her to treat these physical sensations as data, as information about her authentic response before her conditioning kicked in and overrode it with what she thought she should feel. Carmen began practicing saying no, small no's at first, declining to stay late at work, telling a friend she couldn't help with a move, canceling plans when she was tired instead of pushing through. And these tiny acts of self-preservation felt enormous, felt almost impossible. And she noticed how much anxiety they produced, how her nervous system would go into high alert as if she had done something dangerous, how she would immediately want to explain, to apologize, to make sure the other person knew it wasn't personal. And Isabel helped her see this as her young self getting activated. The part that learned early that disappointing people was catastrophic, that her job was to manage everyone else's feelings even at the expense of her own. And slowly, through repetition, Carmen began to teach her nervous system that she could say no and survive it. That relationships that couldn't tolerate her having boundaries weren't actually relationships worth maintaining. The legal aspects of the divorce were straightforward in a way that felt almost insulting. Assets divided, accounts separated, their shared life reduced to a series of line items on a spreadsheet. And Carmen's lawyer had encouraged her to fight for more, had pointed out that she had literally given him an organ, that surely this counted for something in terms of what she was owed. But Carmen found she didn't want to fight, didn't want to prolong the connection, didn't want to spend more months negotiating with a man who had already demonstrated so clearly what he thought she was worth. And she signed the papers and let him go. And there was a kind of power in that, in choosing to release him rather than being released, in recognizing that continuing to argue about money or property would only keep her tethered to someone who had proven himself incapable of the kind of love she deserved. But there was still the matter of the kidney, the physical fact of it, the scar that ran across her abdomen and the organ that lived inside him. And this was harder to release, because how do you let go of something that is literally inside another person's body? How do you make peace with having given something so irreplaceable to someone who treated you as replaceable? And Carmen struggled with this, found herself having intrusive thoughts about the kidney, imagining it inside him, functioning, keeping him alive. And there was something bitter in knowing that she would spend the rest of her life with one kidney while he walked around with two. One of them hers, and she worked on this in therapy, worked on finding a way to think about the kidney that didn't keep her connected to him. And eventually she arrived at a kind of reframe, which was that the kidney was hers even though it was in his body, that she had given it freely. That it was a gift that said something about her capacity for love even if it said nothing good about his capacity to honor that love, that she could be proud of her generosity without needing him to acknowledge it. The 1-year anniversary of the surgery came and went, and Carmen marked it quietly, alone, lighting a candle and sitting with herself, honoring what she had been through. And she thought about how different she was now from the woman who had gone into that operating room, how that Carmen had believed that sacrifice was the highest form of love, that giving until it hurt was what good women did, that her body was a tool to be used in service of others. And this Carmen, the one sitting here a year later, understood something different, understood that love without reciprocity is not love but exploitation, that sacrifice that destroys you serves no one, that taking care of yourself is not selfish but necessary. And she felt a tenderness toward her younger self, toward the woman who had tried so hard, who had believed so deeply, who had given so much. And she also felt a strength she hadn't known she possessed. A kind of hard-won wisdom that came from having survived something she thought would destroy her. The question of whether she would ever trust anyone enough to be in a relationship again was one Carmen circled around with both longing and fear. Because part of her wanted companionship, wanted the warmth of being known, wanted someone to share her days with. But another part of her was simply exhausted by the prospect, tired of explaining herself, tired of negotiating needs, tired of the vulnerability that intimacy required. And Isabel pointed out that this was okay. That Carmen didn't need to make any decisions about her romantic future right now, that she could simply be with herself, could learn to be her own companion. And there was something revolutionary in this permission, in the idea that she didn't need to be coupled to be complete, that she could build a life that was full and meaningful on its own terms, that the default setting didn't have to be partnership. She began traveling alone, small trips at first, a weekend in a nearby city, then bolder excursions, a week in New Mexico, 10 days in Portugal. And these solo journeys taught her things about herself she hadn't known. That she liked waking without an alarm, that she preferred museums in the morning before they got crowded, that she would rather eat dinner early and go to bed with a book than stay out late. And these small preferences felt like discoveries, like she was meeting herself for the first time. Not the self who had shaped herself around someone else's needs, but her actual self. The person she was when no one was watching, when she didn't have to perform or accommodate or explain. And she began to fall in love with this person, began to enjoy her own company, began to understand that the relationship with herself was the foundation on which everything else had to be built. The support group evolved over the months. Some women left as they healed and moved forward, new women arrived with fresh wounds, and Carmen found herself in the strange position of being one of the older members, someone newer women looked to for hope, for proof that you could survive this kind of betrayal and come out the other side. And she took this role seriously, showed up every Tuesday, shared her journey honestly, didn't pretend it was easy or linear, didn't offer false comfort, but did offer presence, did offer witnessing, did offer the simple truth that time doesn't heal all wounds, but it does change your relationship to them, does give you distance and perspective, does teach you that you are larger than what happened to you. There was a younger woman named Sophie who came to the group about 18 months after Carmen started attending. And Sophie's story was different in its details but similar in its structure. She had given up her PhD program to follow her boyfriend to another state for his job, had worked part-time to support them, had been promised that once he was established they would move somewhere she could finish her degree, and then he had decided he didn't want to be with her anymore. Had said the relationship had run its course, had left her in a city where she knew no one, without her degree, without her career path, without the future she had planned. And Sophie was so angry, rightfully angry, and Carmen recognized that anger, remembered when she had felt it, when it had consumed her. And she told Sophie that the anger was necessary, was healthy, was the appropriate response to betrayal, but that underneath the anger was grief. And underneath the grief was the harder work of understanding what in her had been willing to make herself so small. The conversation about boundaries became central to Carmen's healing, because she began to see how much of her life had been lived without them, how she had treated herself like public property, available to whoever needed her, responsive to every request, unable to say no even when yes cost her everything. And learning to set boundaries felt like learning a new language, like trying to speak with an accent she had never practiced. And there were so many mistakes. So many times she reverted to old patterns, so many moments when the fear of disappointing someone overpowered her commitment to protecting herself. But gradually, with practice, it became more natural, became something she could do without as much internal conflict, became a way of honoring herself. She began to notice how often women were praised for being easygoing or low maintenance, how these terms that sounded like compliments were actually describing women who had no boundaries, who didn't assert needs, who made themselves convenient, and she began to bristle at this language, began to see how it served a system that benefited from women's self-sacrifice, that depended on women's willingness to shrink, and she found herself speaking up about it, gently at first and then more forcefully. Pointing out to friends when they were diminishing themselves, questioning the stories they told about why they had to be the ones to accommodate, to adjust, to make it work. The second year after the divorce was harder in some ways than the first, because the shock had worn off, because she could no longer move through her days in that protective numbness, because she had to actually feel everything she had been holding at bay. And there were weeks when the grief felt oceanic, when she would cry for hours, when getting out of bed felt like an impossible task, when she questioned whether she would ever feel normal again, and Isabel assured her this was part of the process. That healing wasn't linear, that sometimes you had to go down before you could come back up. And Carmen learned to trust this, learned to let herself feel without judging the feeling, learned that crying for 3 hours on a Saturday didn't mean she was broken, but that she was finally allowing herself to acknowledge the magnitude of what she had lost. But there were also moments of unexpected joy, small openings of light that caught her by surprise. A morning when she woke up and realized she had slept through the night without anxiety dreams. An afternoon when she laughed at something a friend said, and the laugh came from her belly, deep and real. A walk through her neighborhood when she noticed the trees were blooming and felt something like hope move through her chest. And these moments accumulated, created a counterweight to the grief. Suggested that there was a future that included something other than pain, that she was slowly, imperceptibly, becoming someone who could imagine being happy again. She started painting, something she hadn't done since college, set up an easel in the corner of her apartment and bought supplies. And the paintings were terrible at first, muddy colors and uncertain lines. But she didn't care about whether they were good, cared only that they were hers, that they emerged from something in her that had nothing to do with anyone else's approval or validation. And there was a freedom in this, in making something that existed only for her pleasure. That didn't have to be useful or beautiful or meaningful to anyone else, and she would lose hours to painting, would enter a flow state where time collapsed and there was only color and movement and the pleasure of creation. The question of forgiveness came up in therapy, and Carmen found she had complicated feelings about it. Because on one hand she understood intellectually that forgiveness was supposed to be liberating, that holding onto anger was like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. But on the other hand she didn't want to forgive Richard, didn't feel he deserved forgiveness, didn't want to let him off the hook by offering absolution he hadn't asked for. And Isabel suggested that maybe forgiveness wasn't about him at all, wasn't about deciding he was worthy of being forgiven, but about deciding she was worthy of being free from the weight of what he had done. And this reframe helped, shifted forgiveness from something she did for him to something she did for herself. A way of releasing the burden without excusing the behavior. She ran into Richard once, about 2 years after the divorce was finalized, in a grocery store of all places, and she saw him before he saw her, had a moment to decide whether to walk away or to say hello, and she surprised herself by staying, by letting him see her. And he looked startled, almost afraid, and they had a brief, awkward conversation. Surface pleasantries about how they were doing, what they were up to. And Carmen felt nothing, no anger, no longing, no bitterness. Just a kind of neutral curiosity about this person who had once been central to her life and was now a stranger. And after they said goodbye and went their separate ways, Carmen stood in the produce section holding a bag of apples and realized she was free, actually free, that he no longer had any power over her emotional state, that she had taken back all the energy she had spent thinking about him, analyzing him, trying to understand him, and redirected it toward herself. The third year brought a different kind of healing, more integration than transformation, a settling into her new life rather than a constant battle to build it. And Carmen found a rhythm that felt sustainable, work that engaged her, friendships that nourished her, hobbies that brought her joy, and she began to understand that she didn't need a grand romance or a dramatic redemption arc to have a meaningful life, that the quiet daily practice of caring for herself was actually the revolution. That choosing her own well-being over and over again in small moments was how you built a different kind of existence. And she felt proud of this life, proud of the woman she was becoming, proud that she had survived something that could have destroyed her, and had instead used it as an opportunity to rebuild herself according to her own specifications, rather than someone else's blueprint. She started volunteering at a women's shelter helping women who were leaving abusive relationships, and this work felt meaningful in a way that fed her, because she could offer these women the kind of support she wished she had received, could help them see that they were not crazy, that their perceptions were valid, that they deserved better, and she could do this from a place of genuine understanding rather than abstract compassion, could say, I know what it feels like to doubt yourself. I know what it feels like to think you're the problem. I know what it feels like to believe you'll never recover. And I'm here to tell you that you will, that you're stronger than you know, that the capacity for survival that brought you to this shelter is the same capacity that will carry you into whatever comes next. The women in the shelter asked her sometimes about her story, how she had ended up volunteering, and she would tell them, would share about the kidney and the divorce, and they would look at her with a mixture of shock and recognition. And they would ask how she got through it, what was the turning point, when did she start to feel better? And Carmen would tell them the truth, which was that there wasn't one turning point but 1,000 small decisions, 1,000 moments when she chose herself over the old patterns. When she honored her feelings instead of explaining them away, when she set a boundary even though it felt impossible, when she let herself cry, when she let herself rest, when she asked for help, when she showed up to therapy even when she didn't want to, when she kept going even when she couldn't see the path forward. And she would tell them that it was both harder and simpler than it seemed. That the work was mostly showing up and being willing to feel everything without trying to fix it too quickly or make it pretty or rush to forgiveness before it was real. There was a moment about 3.5 years after the divorce, when Carmen was hiking alone in the mountains, the kind of solo trip she had learned to love, and she reached a summit and stood looking out over the landscape, the vast rolling green of it, the sky enormous overhead, and she felt a kind of wholeness she hadn't expected. A sense that she was complete exactly as she was, that she didn't need another person to validate her existence or give her life meaning, that she was enough. Had always been enough, would always be enough, and this knowing settled into her bones, became something solid she could rely on. And she understood that this was the gift that had emerged from the betrayal, not that the betrayal was good or justified or something to be grateful for, but that the work of healing from it had led her to herself, had forced her to excavate all the ways she had been living in accordance with other people's scripts instead of her own truth, had given her the opportunity to choose differently, to build a life that honored her actual needs and desires rather than her conditioned responses. She thought about the kidney sometimes, less frequently now but still occasionally, thought about it functioning inside Richard's body, keeping him alive, and she made peace with this by understanding that the kidney had been hers to give, that the giving said something about her capacity for love and generosity, and that Richard's inability to honor that gift said nothing about its value and everything about his character, and she didn't need him to acknowledge what she had done, didn't need him to feel grateful, didn't need any particular response from him because the meaning she made of her own actions was sufficient, was between her and herself, was part of how she understood her own story, and she could be proud of her generosity without needing him to validate it. The question of whether she would donate an organ again, if someone else she loved needed one, was one she considered honestly, and the answer was complicated because she didn't regret the surgery itself, didn't regret that she had acted from love even if that love was not returned in the way she had hoped. But she would do it differently now, would make sure she was giving from a place of fullness rather than fear, would ensure that the relationship was reciprocal before making such a significant sacrifice, would check with herself about whether she was giving because she genuinely wanted to or because she believed she had to in order to be worthy of love. And this discernment, this capacity to distinguish between generous giving and compulsive self-sacrifice, was something she had learned through painful experience, was something that now protected her in ways she hadn't known she needed protection. Carmen built a life in those years that looked nothing like what she had imagined for herself when she married Richard, but that felt more authentically hers than anything she had lived before. A small apartment filled with her paintings, windows that caught the morning light, plants she tended with care, books stacked in precarious piles, a community of friends who knew her actual self, not the performed version she had offered in her marriage. And she had learned to take pleasure in small things, in coffee drunk slowly, in walks with no destination, in the particular quality of afternoon light, in the satisfaction of a day lived according to her own rhythms rather than someone else's schedule. She dated occasionally, met people through friends or apps, had conversations over drinks or dinner, and some of these people were kind, were interesting, were people she might have tried to build something with in her old life. But Carmen found she had become discerning in ways that would have seemed impossibly picky before. She noticed immediately when someone talked over her, when someone assumed their preferences should be the default, when someone made decisions without consulting her, when someone related to her as a convenience rather than a person, and she didn't waste time trying to fix these people or teach them how to treat her better. She simply moved on, understood that her energy was finite and precious, and that she wanted to spend it on people who already understood that relationships required reciprocity, who already knew how to see her. She met someone eventually, about 4 years after the divorce, a woman named Alex who worked at a bookstore Carmen frequented, and they started talking one afternoon about a novel they had both read, and the conversation expanded naturally into other books, other ideas, and they exchanged numbers, started texting, met for coffee that turned into a walk that turned into dinner, and Carmen was cautious at first, watching for red flags, protecting herself, but Alex was patient, was willing to go slowly, was interested in Carmen's boundaries and needs, asked questions, listened to answers, remembered details from previous conversations, showed up consistently. And gradually Carmen allowed herself to open, to risk, to believe that perhaps reciprocal love was possible, that not everyone was Richard, that she could trust again without being naive, that her new discernment was a form of protection that would help her choose differently. The relationship with Alex unfolded differently than Carmen's marriage had. There was more negotiation, more explicit conversation about needs and expectations, more willingness to address conflict directly rather than letting it fester, more space for both people to maintain their individual identities while also building something together. And Carmen appreciated this. felt safer in a relationship that acknowledged complexity rather than pretending everything was easy. That made room for her to say, "This doesn't work for me," without it being treated as a betrayal. That understood love as something you actively built together rather than something that simply happened to you and that you were supposed to maintain through sheer force of will. She told Alex about the kidney eventually, about the divorce, about the whole story. And Alex listened without judgment, without trying to fix it or make it less than it was. Simply witnessed Carmen's experience and said, "I'm sorry that happened to you. You deserved so much better," and those words, simple as they were, landed somewhere deep in Carmen's chest. Because they were the words she had needed to hear all along. The acknowledgement that what had happened was wrong, that she had been treated badly. That her suffering mattered, and Alex held her while she cried, held space for the grief that still lived in her body even after all these years. And Carmen felt held in a way she hadn't known she needed, felt seen in her vulnerability, felt loved not despite her wounds, but as someone whole and worthy exactly as she was. The work of healing is never finished. Carmen learned, because healing is not a destination but a practice, a way of being with yourself that you return to again and again. And there were still hard days, still moments when the old patterns would activate, when she would feel the urge to accommodate or disappear or sacrifice herself. But now she had tools, had awareness, had a different relationship to these impulses, could notice them without being controlled by them, could choose differently, and this constant recommitment to her own well-being was how she built a different life, how she became a different person, not perfect but honest, not invulnerable but strong in her willingness to feel everything, not without scars but proud of them, proud of how much she had survived and what she had learned and who she was becoming. She stood in front of the mirror sometimes, looked at the scar across her abdomen, the physical reminder of everything she had been through, and instead of feeling shame or regret, she felt something like reverence, because that scar was proof of her capacity to survive, to endure, to transform suffering into wisdom. And she would touch it gently, this mark that once represented her deepest wound, and thank her body for carrying her through. Thank herself for refusing to give up even when giving up would have been easier. Thank the journey for teaching her that she was never broken, was always whole, was always worthy, was always enough. The kidney lives inside Richard still, keeps him alive, functions as kidneys do, filters his blood, maintains his electrolyte balance, allows him to live his life, and Carmen has made peace with this, understands that the kidney was a gift she gave freely, that she can be proud of her generosity without needing him to honor it, that the meaning of the gift is hers to determine. And she has determined that it represents her capacity for profound love, her willingness to sacrifice for someone she cared about. Her beautiful, foolish hope that love was something mutual and sacred. And even though she was wrong about Richard, even though he proved himself unworthy of that particular gift, she was not wrong about love itself, was not wrong about her capacity for it, was not wrong about the importance of generosity and care. She was only wrong about where to direct it. And now she knows, now she has learned to direct that love toward herself first, to fill her own cup before pouring into others. To understand that self-love is not selfish but foundational, is the basis on which all other love must be built. The woman Carmen has become is someone she respects, someone she enjoys spending time with, someone who knows her worth and doesn't negotiate it, someone who can love deeply without losing herself, someone who trusts her own perceptions and honors her own needs, someone who has transformed betrayal into wisdom, grief into strength, loss into liberation. And she looks back at the woman who gave her kidney with tenderness, with compassion, with understanding. And she tells that younger self, you did your best. You loved as well as you knew how, you survived something that could have destroyed you. And look at you now, look at what you have built from the ruins. Look at how you learned to choose yourself. Look at how you became the person you needed all along. And this, Carmen understands, is the real surgery, the real transplant, not the kidney that moved from her body to his, but the self-love that grew from the space where her illusions used to be. The boundaries that replaced her accommodation, the wisdom that emerged from her willingness to feel everything and let it transform her. And she is whole now, not because she has two kidneys, but because she has herself fully, completely, without apology or explanation. And that is more than enough, has always been enough, will always be enough.